Hello, Patreon. I don't think this video is going to count as the vlog for this month. I will do a vlog later, but this is exclusive rant content. I mentioned on a video this week that I have some thoughts that I'm like, this doesn't really fit on my main channel. It doesn't really fit on my second channel. Like, where am I going to put this? Answer, Patreon. So, this is a little bit of a rant video about movies, TV shows with dragons in them. And I think maybe I'm just a little bit cursed by having read Christopher Paolini's books. If you're at all familiar with the inheritance cycle, my partner and I have been huge fans of them for a long time. He got me into them, and I've been considering starting a podcast with him where we talk about it. Let me know in the comments if you're at all interested in that. But, okay, so something bothers me about the way that dragons are portrayed. So I'm going to be referencing like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, but if you haven't seen them, that's fine. I'm not going to spoil anything. This, like, okay, so the visual effects aspect is really difficult. I've been recently watching some Corridor Crew videos, and, it's tough to do good visual effects for especially complicated creatures like dragons. They've got complex anatomy that is unlike most anatomy that we're familiar with, and there's like all this detail on the surface and trying to get the shadows and the lighting correct. I get it. Here's my complaint. Two things, really. The first thing is the interaction of these animals with their environment is usually not done well. And two, the flight behavior of these animals is not done very well. So yeah, again, curse you, Christopher Paolini, for making me think about this every time. But so something that bugs me is like, okay, these animals are moving huge amounts of air with their wings, and that is going to create a concussive wave, and it is going to create like a huge amount of air movement. So like toward the end of Game of Thrones, you've got these large dragons arriving near tents, like flying down near tents, and the tent just kind of like flutters in the wind a tiny bit, and it's like, no, that tent should be like whipped like a hurricane wind, like it should be like almost collapsing. In fact, that would increase the realism for me if you have let's just say, for example, you have an encampment of a bunch of tents, and the dragon is landing or taking off. I think it would be appropriate, and it would increase the realism for me if the wind force being created by the dragon was like it flattened a couple of tents, like it like knocked them around. Additionally, and this is, I guess, a little bit harder to show, but the dragons like must be enormously heavy. I mean, obviously their flight physics kind of doesn't make a lot of sense because they're huge animals. Like, so we think of birds, and birds have like hollow bones or like very lightweight skeletons. And so these like dragons that have in George R. R. Martin's work, they have iron skeletons. Like the bones and the teeth are black because they have iron in them, which, like, I'm just like mostly setting aside in Christopher Paolini's world, the inheritance cycle, like the physics is a little bit waved away because of the fact that the dragons are sustained by magic. Like the dragons cannot fly over a magic canceling barrier because they will drop out of the sky. Like you cannot cross the barrier by means of magic, or like you can't send a message by means of magic through this barrier. So like that's how it's explained there. I'm mostly just gonna like hand wave it away and say whatever about how heavy these animals are. But like they are heavy. They're armored, and their skeletons are iron sometimes, and like their scales are presumably heavy. They have a lot of muscle, especially like the wyvern type dragons. Like, so technically, like a dragon has 6 limbs which is evolutionarily not at all how things would be. Like, unless your world has six-limbed animals, dragons would not fit in any evolutionary tree because they would have two shoulder sockets, like two different limb sockets up here. So you've got the wyvern types, which is what the House of the Dragons and the Game of Thrones dragons are like, which is they have legs down below, and then they have the wing arm, and they have this enormous breast, like huge, and that is closer to what would be accurate according to like evolution and looking at other flighted animals. Like, they need a huge chest muscle apparatus, basically. But yeah, so the animals should be really heavy. So when they land, again, if they were to land and knock something off, knock something over by the force of their weight hitting the ground, I think that would do a lot to increase the realism and like get some more camera shake of them when they hit the ground, not hit the, you know what I mean, when they land, because yeah, it's an enormous heavy animal hitting the ground, like landing, even if they land, gently, as far as a dragon can land gently, it's still going to shake the earth, So those type of things bug me, where, because like in Paolini's thing, there's like a part of one of the books, and I guess this is a little bit of a spoiler, but like some magic users have to create an illusion of a dragon, and that is one of the concerns that the magic users mention, is like it's like not even that hard to replicate the dragon. The most difficult thing is replicating the effect that it has on its environment, in that sense of like the concussive forces of wind, like the thud, like it would hurt your ears to be near a flying dragon, and like if you had a bunch of them in flight, it would be deafening. It would be like thunder, constant thunder, because they're like woof woof. It's like each stroke of their wings, I would say they don't break the sound barrier quite to that level, but like, yeah, it's like a similar concussive force that you would be dealing with. And then the bigger pet peeve, I have gone on for 7.5 minutes about this. my bigger pet peeve is the flight physics of dragons. So again, I'm kind of trying to leave aside the fact that these are enormously heavy animals, and like you would need to have a wingspan a certain length, and then like whatever, the older a dragon gets, the harder it should be for it to take off. Like in House of the Dragon, there is an enormous dragon, hundreds of years old, and she takes off from the ground, and I honestly think that bigger dragons would have a much harder time taking off from the ground. It's like how bats, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but bats have a really hard time taking off from the ground. So, in the past, I've had a bat in the building, and I've had to like go I got my leather gloves, and I got a towel, and I picked up the bat, and like I called a lady who was like telling me what to do on the phone, for like taking care of wildlife and stuff. And she told me like, okay, yeah, get your leather gloves, get the towel, pick it up off the ground, and then go place the whole towel in a tree, so that it can get out of the towel into the tree, and then it can take off, because bats don't take off well from the ground. And we're talking about a really, really tiny animal, but with the same kind of anatomy, with the two legs at the bottom and then the wing arms. So I'm not going to make a blanket statement that all dragons should have a hard time taking off from the ground, but I think especially the biggest dragons should probably need to take off from at least a little bit of a height, like a cliff or something. So my biggest pet peeve, and this, I guess it applies to other flying scenes as well. Like I remember a scene from The Rescuers Down Under with an eagle where this same thing happens. But so animals that fly, not only do they rely on this like flapping motion, but especially predators in the air, if they're still, if you see a predator like a hawk being still with their wings out, they are relying on thermal pillars of air, because hot air rises. So whenever you see a bird with its wings just kind of out, it's riding on thermals. And now this might be the Animorphs from back in the day influencing my thought process on this as well. But like they're relying on thermal energy, like to keep them aloft, the rising pillars of air. The air over water is cold. So like if you might see like a bird dive down into water and then they have to flap really heavily to get back up, right? What you don't see, what doesn't make sense in terms of the physics, is an enormously heavy animal like a dragon flying just like this, just wings out like this over water. And it happens constantly, and they're just skimming over the water, and maybe the wingtip like dips down and touches the water there. Completely unrealistic, massively unrealistic. Like we're talking about an enormously heavy animal. So even if it's not over water, you'll sometimes see like, you know, there was one scene in House of the Dragon where I guess it's not really a spoiler. I'm not telling you anything about who it is, but there's a dragon who flies in between the cliff here, and it's flying in between, and it has to tuck in its wings a little bit in order to fly in that crevice, and it maintains altitude with its wings half tucked in. And it's like that animal should be dropping at least a little bit. And now a heavy animal, if it stops flapping or if it's not riding a thermal, should just start dropping, because it's a heavy animal. And like if we're trying to have realistic physics, like again, on a fundamental level, the physics of dragons flying shouldn't happen. Like it's not really possible for animals that large. I mean, like with pterosaurs, we have our closest example of heavy-ish animals, with wingspans like what? I'm not going to look it up right now, but I'm curious. Like, what is the wingspan of a pterosaur? Some of the biggest pterosaurs. I'm going to guess like 20 feet, something like that. But they are very skinny on their like in their bodies, so like and they don't have this like enormous neck thing going on. Anyway, so yeah, dragons in particular flying over water without flapping, like they're just coasting like this instead of going like whoop, 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 over water. That is not possible. Like if you're right over the water, if you're like thousands of feet in the air, it probably doesn't make as much of a difference. But for them to be skimming right on top of the water and then like touching their wingtips into the water, oh my god, it pulls me out. It genuinely will pull me out of the moment. And I'm like, ugh. I'm sitting there rolling my eyes going, why? It's because it's a cool shot. Like, I mean, I'm gonna admit it's cinematically, it's a cool shot. Okay, so I kind of understand the logic of like, this is something that we're doing just because it looks cool, but it breaks my immersion. These animals, like, I mean, in George R. R. Martin's universe, magic like doesn't seem to include the dragons flying. Like they are trying to make them accurate to what would be evolutionarily fitting, and getting the large breast so that it's like accurate to what the anatomy of these animals would have to be in order for them to take flight. Like even the fire, it seems like they probably have some kind of more like a science fiction justification rather than like a fantasy justification. Because again, in Christopher Paolini's books, the fire is a form of magic, whereas in Game of Thrones, it kind of seems like they have like almost an extra salival gland, but where the fire comes out in like these jets on the side of their mouths. I get with Vhagar, her fire kind of rises from her throat. But yeah, so I'm just bothered. I'm just a little bit bothered. And of course, like I still love portrayals of dragons, and like How to Train Your Dragon, House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, Christopher Paolini. I am really looking for. Part of the reason my partner and I are talking about doing a podcast for the Inheritance Cycle Christopher Paolini books is that there apparently is progress being made on a Disney Plus show. So, you know, because we have the technology at this point to portray dragons accurately, and there is no movie in Ba Sing Se. So, yeah, I'm curious to see how that goes as well. Uh, and yeah, like, because if Paolini is part of the writing, like, again, a lot of these ideas that I have are from Paolini's writing, like cool air over water, and like just stuff like that that I think about. It's because there are point of view chapters where we hear the perspective of a dragon thinking about how they're flying, and like thinking about, you know, how to do this safely, and the fact that if they are not actively engaged in like some amount of flapping, they will plummet out of the sky, and that, you know, that is, you know, you can't just coast along, and you can't partially tuck in your wings without experiencing some kind of drop. um I mean, yeah, again, you can coast along if you're up high, relying on those thermal pillars of air, but yeah, again, just like not over water. So anyway, that was all. I just wanted to rant about that, and that's pretty much it. Okay, bye.